Hello everybody, my name is Junaid Khalid Mir and I will be doing a presentation today on visual fields. So what is visual fields? When you look at the vision, for example, if you close one eye, you'll realize that when you're looking straight ahead, that you don't only see where your eyes are pointing, rather you see a broad area of your vision. For example, you might be looking straight ahead, but you'll be aware of if objects were to pass in the periphery of your vision, meaning not in front of you, but to your side, you'll be aware of that. So that means the eye itself does pick up more than just where your eyes, where you actually fixating upon, or more than where your eyes are actually fixated upon. So that whole area that you see in one given moment, that's referred to as the visual fields. And we can, in certain conditions within the eye, you might find that the visual field can be compromised. And the aim of today's lecture is to look at those different kind or different variants of compromise to the visual fields, and to see what they look like and to be able to identify them. And today I won't actually be going into the actual referral protocols, because that is something that's specific to the area that you're working in. So please do refer to your local referral protocols with regards to how you should manage or how you should deal with a particular visual field defect. So the visual field is all related to the information transmitted to or transmitted through the nerve fibers of the eye. That is what, so that whole visual pathway, which we will look at on the next slide here, we'll touch on more detail. The whole visual pathway is what results in you sensing what you see at any given moment. So in order to understand visual fields and in order to understand where or what might be the particular area of the eye or particular area of the visual pathway that's been affected, as it is being affected, causing that particular visual field defect, you have to be familiar with and understand the visual pathway. And let's go through the journey of the actual nerve fibers. So if we look at the fundus, which is this diagram over here, it's a representation of the actual fundus of the right eye. We can see how the nerve fibers are distributed within the right fundus. So you find that they are actually distributed in a very circular or arcuate fashion. We have the central bundle here, that's known as papillomacular bundle. And then you have the superior arcuate fibers, and then you have the inferior arcuate fibers, and you have the inferior radiating fibers and the superior radiating fibers over there. So this diagram is quite useful because some of the visual field defects that you might see in practice will actually correspond to the actual arrangement of the nerve fibers that you see on that diagram. More in particular, the glaucomatous defects, and the defects caused by glaucomatous damage to the optic nerve in the back of the eye. But that will all come later in this presentation today. So this is where we can say, this is where the journey of, or if I'm looking at it from one perspective, we can say this is where the journey of the nerve fibers start. So looking at it from the fundus, we find that that is how they are arranged and how they are distributed within the actual fundus. And then they gather at the optic nerve, at the optic nerve head. And then from there, they exit the eye, and then that takes us on to the next diagram here. This diagram actually shows you the whole visual pathway, starting from the fundus where the nerve fiber layer is, going all the way back to the primary visual cortex. So the nerve fibers from the eye travels all through this, all these different structures that are labeled there. We will go through them one by one. All these different structures that are labeled there, and they end up at the primary visual cortex at the back. So before we go into that, let's look at what part of your visual field corresponds to which part of your retina. Now, we've all heard that everything that we see is actually reversed when it hits the retina. all the image is inversed or reversed when it hits the retina. So if you look at this diagram from the front here, you can see that the temporal retina meaning the side away, the furthest away from the nose. So you can imagine the nose would be here. And the temporal retina is the furthest side, from the side furthest away from the nose, and the nasal retina is the side that's closest to the nose. So the nasal retina is labeled or diagrammed in red, and the temporal retina is diagrammed in blue. And on the left eye, and on the right eye, the nasal retina is diagrammed in blue, and the temporal retina is diagrammed in brown or orange there. So for the left eye, we can see that the temporal retina is responsible for the perception of the visual field, the nasal visual field. So this particular area over here. And the nasal retina is responsible for the perception of the temporal visual field. Which means if an object was to be slightly superior to your fixation, then in the retina it will fall in the nasal in the inferior part of your retina. And if an object outside in the real world was placed temporally to fixation, then that would correspond to the meaning the object would be projected onto the nasal part of the retina. That would correspond to the nasal part of the retina. So you'll find that it's inverse. The relationship between where the object is projected on the retina in comparison to where it actually is located on the actual visual field, meaning in the real world that you look at. That's important to understand, as that will allow you to work out exactly where or whereabouts within the visual field is compromised when looking at visual field defects, and that allows you to work out where the compromisation is within the structures of the visual pathway. So we start at the nerve fiber layers in the eye. Once they exit the eye, they are referred to as the optic nerve. So we have the right optic nerve here, and we have the left optic nerve over there. And what you'll find is when they exit the eye, like we split it up into two parts, the nasal retina, so all the nerve fibers that innervate, you can say, the temporal part of the retina, and all the nerve fibers that are located within the nasal retina, they are two separate divisions. And we make that division because what you'll find is as they reach this area, which is known as the optic chiasm, the optic chiasma or optic chiasm, you'll find that the nasal fibers, and they cross over to the other side. Meaning from the left eye, the nasal fibers, when they reach the optic chiasm, they cross over to the right side. The left crosses over to the right. And the nasal fibers of the right eye, when they reach the optic chiasm, they cross over to the left side. So the nasal fibers, they cross over at the optic chiasma. And however, the temporal fibers, they stay on the same side. Meaning the left temporal fibers, at the optic chiasm, they remain on the left. And the right temporal fibers, they remain on the right when they reach the optic chiasm. So it's only the nasal fibers that cross over. So when they exit the eye, they are called the optic nerve. The nerve fibers are referred to as the optic nerve. This area here is called the optic nerve until they reach the point where the nasal fiber crossover. That point is referred to as the optic chiasma. That's the name of that location. Then once they cross over, then the area between the LGN and the optic chiasma is referred to as the optic tract, as you can see on this label here. So this area here referred to as the optic tract, and likewise for the right side as well. The right optic tract and the left optic tract. The right optic nerve and left optic nerve. Then this particular structure here is called the LGN, or particular location is called the LGN, lateral genicular nucleus. And then once the nerve fibers pass that area, this area is referred to as the optic radiation. The optic radiation. And the optic radiation is of two divisions. You have the upper optic radiation, which loops, and you have you have the lower optic radiation, which loops, and you have the upper optic radiation, which does not loop. And that is better demonstrated on a different diagram here. So as you can see, that's the LGN, and then this is referred to, where it loops here, this is referred to as the lower optic radiation, whereas where it goes straight and it doesn't loop, these three lines here refer to as the upper optic radiation. So the optic radiation is of two types, the lower and the upper division. And then you have the last structure, or the last key location in the visual pathway, which is referred to as the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex. So that is the visual pathway. We start off at the fundus, where we have the temporal and the nasal fibers. And then when it exits the eye, it's referred to as the optic nerve. And when it crosses over at this location, where the nasal fiber cross over, is referred to as the optic chiasma. And when it goes beyond that area, is referred to as the optic tract. And then it reaches this particular location known as the LGN. And then following that, we have the optic radiation, which is of the two divisions, upper and lower optic radiation. And then lastly, we end up at the primary visual cortex. So that is the visual pathway. And that's important to know. It's important to visualize where the nerve fibers are within the optic, within the visual pathway. That will all correspond to the different types of visual field defects that we may see. This next slide shows you the different terminologies that you will find when you're describing visual field defects. So we are not describing them yet. We're just talking about the terms that we may use when we see a visual field defect in front of us. We will use certain terminologies to describe that. So number one is homonymous. Homonymous means that the visual field defect in one eye is on the same side. By the same side, we don't mean nasal and temporal. We mean right and left. And the diagrams that come later will clarify that. So we'll come to that. So it's on the same side, meaning if the visual field defect in the left eye is on the right side, and on the right eye is also on the right side, then we class that as a homonymous visual field defect. So homonymous means visual field defect in one eye is on the same side, meaning right or left side, as the visual field defect in the other eye. And the heteronymous is the opposite of homonymous, meaning the visual field defect in one eye is on the opposite side of the visual field defect in the other eye. For example, the visual field defect in the right eye is on the left side, whereas the visual field defect on the left eye is on the right side. So they remain on the opposite side, and that would be classed as a heteronymous visual field defect. And then superior, you may already know that term, which means that the visual field defect is located in the upper part of the visual field. Obviously, this term superior is in the context of visual field defects. Superior on its own does mean up, or located in the upper part. In this context, it's visual field defect located in the upper part of the visual field. Inferior means the visual field defect is located in the lower part of the visual field. Hemianopia means that there's a loss of half of the visual field, which respect the vertical midline. What you'll find in glaucomatous visual field defects is that they respect the horizontal midline. As you can see in this diagram, you'll find that it's symmetrical across the horizontal midline, more or less symmetrical. So if a certain nerve fiber was to get damaged, for example, the papillomacular bundle, you might see an arcuate defect corresponding to the actual arrangement of the nerve fiber. and you'll find that it wouldn't cross the horizontal midline because of the way the nerve fibers are arranged in the fundus. Whereas hemianopia is a loss of half of the visual field if visual field with respect to the vertical midline. Quadrantenopia is loss of a quarter of the visual field. The diagrams will clarify all these terms that we're looking at. So we'll move ahead. So here, if you look at this diagram, this side of the diagram represents the visual field of the right eye from the patient's perspective. So this diagram means that the patient in his right eye, when he closes his left eye, he can only see what's on the right half side of his visual field, whereas the left half side is all blind. And this diagram on the left represents the visual field of the patient's left eye from the patient's perspective, which means that when the patient closes his right eye, he can see half of the left side of his visual field, whereas the right side, the right half of his visual field is blind or compromised. This type of defect, if he was to have this, is known as a binasal. Bi meaning two, because it affects both eyes. His right and left eye are affected. Nasal because the defect is closest to the nose on each eye. So on the right eye, it's the left side that's affected, which is closest to the nose, and on the left eye is the right side of the visual field that's affected, which is also closest to the nose. So this is known as binasal hemianopia. If you remember the term, hemianopia means loss of half of the visual field with respect to the vertical midline. So this is a hemianopia because half of the visual field has been compromised. We say it's binasal because it's the closest to the nose on both sides, meaning on the right and the left eye. So binasal, bi meaning two, because both eyes are affected. Nasal is on closest to the nose. Hemianopia, half of the visual field is missing. Look at the next diagram. You'll find it's the opposite of the first. This is called bitemporal because it's the visual field that's affected is the one that's the furthest away from the nose. The one that's furthest away from the nose. And it's also called hemianopia because half of the visual field is compromised. So this is known as a bitemporal hemianopia. Another term, homonymous, the visual field defect is in one eye is on the same side as the visual field defect in the other eye. Diagram number 4 is an example of a homonymous visual field defect. Because if you look at the left eye, it's the right half that's affected, and on the right eye is also the right half that's affected. So in both eyes, it's the right side of the visual field that's compromised. So it's on the same side, meaning the right side. This is described as a right homonymous because it's on the same side. Right homonymous hemianopia. Hemianopia because it's half of the field that's been affected. So that means the binasal hemianopia is an example of a heteronymous visual field defect, which is this term here. That one. The visual field defect in one eye is on the opposite side of the visual field defect in the other eye, because in the left eye, it's the right side that's affected, whereas in the right eye, it's the left side that's affected. So the right and the left, so they're on the opposite sides. And the bitemporal hemianopia is also an example of a heteronymous visual field defect, because it's the left side that's affected on that. However, it's the right side that's affected on the other eye. So they're on opposite sides. So this slide is just to show you how you would describe visual fields. We're not talking about whereabouts it is in the visual field, visual pathway that's been affected, resulting in those visual fields. It's just simply illustrating how we describe visual fields. And it goes on further. Quadrantenopia, we define that as loss of a quarter of the visual field. In these examples, you find that half of the visual field is missing. These are known as hemianopias. Whereas this one, where a quarter, as you can see, just a quarter of the visual field is affected. That is known as a quadrantenopia. So number 5 is known as a right superior quadrantenopia or right upper quadrantenopia. Superior because it affects the superior part of the visual field. And right because it's on the right side. Number 6, right inferior quadrantenopia. And quadrantenopia because it affects quarter of the visual field, inferior or lower because it's on the lower side of the visual field, and it's right because it's on the right side. And these are further descriptions of visual field defects. And this is another visual field defect that you might find, which is described as a right homonymous. Right because it's on the right side, that's affected on each eye. Homonymous because it's on the same side, because in the left eye it's the right side, right half that's affected, and in the right eye is also the right half that's affected. So it's the right side that's affected in both eyes. That's why it's known as homonymous, because it's on the same side. Hemianopia because it's half of the visual field that's affected with macular sparing. Now you'll notice, if you look at the previous example, you'll find that it cuts straight through. The whole half of the visual field was affected, whereas in this diagram, you'll find it doesn't cut straight through, rather there's a small area that's unaffected. That's referred to as macular sparing. The macula is spared. So we describe this as a right homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. Now that we know about the visual field pathway, and that we know how to describe the different type of visual field defects that we might see, we'll move on to locating or corresponding the visual field defect to where the lesion or which part of the visual pathway is affected by that. So it's the same diagram that we covered earlier. We have the temporal fibers and the nasal fibers, temporal fiber of the other eye. And you'll find, as we said earlier, the nasal fibers, they cross over to the other side, like that, at the optic chiasm. And the temporal fibers remain on the same side, and they're going beyond the optic chiasm. You have the LGN over here, and we have the optic radiations. This line, these three lines which go straight down, they are referred to as the upper division. They do not loop, whereas these three lines looping backwards and going around, and they are referred to as the lower division of the optic radiation. And then you end up at the primary visual cortex at the back. So now let's look at the visual field defect. So this visual field defect that you see here, the left fields are normal. The right field has a central scotoma. Scotoma is it's a term which means blind spot. Central because it's in the center of the vision. Central scotoma. Where you find that only one eye is affected, then you know that the defect or the area that's compromised will be within the fundus or will be within the optic nerve, meaning it will be from this area up to the area, these two, before it crosses the optic chiasm. Where you find that both eyes are affected, then we know that the defect exists within the optic chiasm or beyond it, meaning optic tract, LGN, optic radiation, or primary visual cortex. That's because up until this point, the fiber of the left eye stays on the left side, and the fibers of the right eye stays on the right side. So they remain together. At the optic chiasm, the right and the left fibers tend to cross now. So if the defect is only in one eye, then you know that it will be somewhere from this point forward. The defect will be from this point forward. So the central scotoma, so it's labeled out A over here, and they put a mark over there. That would be the area that would be affected. Because it's only one eye, the right eye, so you'll know the defect is somewhere in the right eye. And because it's only a central scotoma, it will be a localized region localized region within the right fundus. B shows a monocular vision loss. So the right visual field is completely, the whole visual field is completely compromised, whereas the left remains clear. So this is an example where the whole optic nerve would be compromised, or the lesion would cover the whole optic nerve. Again, because it affects only one eye, we know that it's not, the defect is nowhere from the optic chiasma beyond. Rather, it exists before the nerve fibers reach the optic chiasma. C is referred to as a bitemporal hemianopia. A bitemporal hemianopia, right? So the nerve fibers that are responsible for the left side of the left visual field are the nasal fiber, the left nasal fibers, and the nerve fibers responsible for the right side of the right visual field is also the nasal fibers that are responsible for that. So the fact that both temporal sides, meaning both nasal fibers, are compromised would mean that the lesion existed in the optic chiasma, because that's the only place where they cross over and they meet. If we look here, the nasal fiber of the left eye and the nasal fiber of the right eye, they meet at this point here in the optic chiasma. So in order for both fibers to be compromised, both nasal fibers to be compromised, the lesion must exist in the optic chiasma where it affects them both together. So we know the lesion is at the optic chiasma. When we see a visual field defect, when we see a bitemporal hemianopia, then we know that the lesion exists in the optic chiasma. You may also get a binasal hemianopia, as we saw previously. Over here. In that case, the lesion would cover the temporal fibers here and the temporal fibers of that. So it would affect them both here. That is what would cause a bitemporal hemianopia. Sorry, binasal hemianopia. That is what would cause a binasal hemianopia. D, contralateral. Contralateral means on the opposite side. And that term contralateral here is not referring to the actual visual field. Rather, it's referring to where the lesion is located on the visual pathway in relation to where the visual field defect is. So if you look at the diagram, you see that it's the left side of the visual field that's compromised, whereas the lesion exists on the right side of the visual pathway. That's why it's called contralateral. D. So if you look at D, it's the optic tract. So the optic chiasma is over here, where C was marked. D is the optic tract. This is the right optic tract. When the right optic tract is compromised, it results in a homonymous hemianopia, a contralateral homonymous hemianopia, meaning if the right optic tract is compromised, then the left half of the field will be affected in both eyes. If the defect was on the left optic tract over here, then what you'll find is the right half of the visual field in both eyes that would be compromised by that. So it is called contralateral. Contralateral means on the opposite side, and ipsilateral means on the same side. So this term contralateral is in relation to the location of the visual field defect and where the lesion exists in the visual pathway. They exist on opposite sides. So when you see a homonymous hemianopia like this, then you'll know that it's the optic tract that's compromised. How is that? Because if you think about it, in the left eye, the fibers that's responsible for the left side of the field, left half of the field, is the nasal fibers in the left eye. In the right eye, the fibers that are responsible for the left half of the right eye are the temporal fibers. Let me go back to that. So you'll find in the left eye is the left side that's affected. So if you look at the diagram, the left side of the field is controlled by the nasal fibers here. And in the right eye, you also find the left side is affected by that. So in the right eye, the left side is also controlled by these. These are the temporal fibers. So it's the nasal fibers in the left eye and the temporal fibers in the right eye. And the place that they come together is the optic tract, as you can see. So looking at these fibers, they come down here, there, and they meet these fibers here at the optic tract. And that's where D is labeled over here. And then E, which is where the optic radiation is. In particular, the lower division of the optic radiation results in a superior quadrantenopia. Again, we see the term contralateral. So if you see a quadrantenopia, you'll know that the optic radiation is the location that's affected by that. So when you see a superior quadrantenopia, then you know it's the inferior optic radiation, inferior division of the optic radiation that's compromised. And when you see an inferior quadrantenopia, meaning the lower quarter of the visual field is compromised, then you know that it's the upper division of the optic radiation that's compromised. And this other visual field defect that we came across was a hemianopia with macular sparing. When you see that, then know that the visual cortex is the location that's affected. When you see a hemianopia with macular sparing, the term contralateral again is in relation to where the lesion is in comparison in relation to the location of the visual field defect. Meaning, in the diagram you see that it's the left half of the visual field that's affected. However, the lesion exists in the right visual cortex, So they're on opposite sides. Contralateral meaning opposite sides. So this is another diagram which not only explains where the lesion exists in the visual pathway, but also gives examples. Yeah, sorry, it does specify where the lesion exists in the visual pathway. So you'll find how we describe the visual field defect along with where the lesion would exist in the visual pathway if you saw that particular visual field defect. The main difference between glaucomatous visual field defects and the ones that we saw previously is that the previous ones tend to respect the vertical midline. They tend to respect the vertical midline, meaning they don't cross over vertically. Whereas glaucomatous visual field defects tend to respect the horizontal midline. As you see, that's the horizontal midline. So you'll find that they'll exist on one side and they won't cross over on the other side. Like this arcuate defect exists on the, it starts from the blind spot and it stops here where the vertical midline is. So it tends to respect that. Unless it's the advanced stage of glaucoma where it starts to then spread beyond the horizontal midline, or the end stage where the whole visual field is lost. So we'll look at these diagrams, and again, just to get familiarity with the terms or the description of the visual field defect itself, you look at the first one, you'll find that the blind spot is located here. So this is the left eye that we're looking at. And you'll find that the nasal aspect of the left eye is compromised. That's a key, or you can say a characteristic visual field defect that's specific to glaucoma. The second one shows as a temporal wedge, which is where the visual field exists in the temporal visual field defect exists in the temporal aspect of the visual field, as demonstrated in the diagram here. And then you have, in C, you have an arcuate defect. Arcuate defect. In D, where it doesn't necessarily extend all the way, but rather covers part of it, this is known as a paracentral defect. Paracentral defect. And then you have, again, another arcuate defect. Along with that, you also have an earlier inferior defect, which is this aspect here. And then you have the tunnel vision defect, which is the late, so the advanced stage or late stage. And then you have the end stage, which is a complete visual field defect. Now, so most commonly, you'll find arcuate shaped ones, nasal step and temporal wedges are the most common manifestation of glaucomatous visual field defects. And these, why they appear that way, is all to do with the arrangement of the nerve fibers that we looked at earlier here. They tend to be arranged in a circular or arcuate fashion, so that when they are affected, their visual field defect correspond to the actual arrangement of the nerve fibers. So we've gone through the types of visual field defects that we might come across. In order for this to be relevant in practice, we need to be able to carry out a visual field test. Now, for those of you who do not know what a visual field testing machine looks like, or Humphrey testing machine looks like, you can watch the YouTube video here if you want to see a visual field test being carried out on a patient. But when you carry out a visual field test, and then you have a printout which looks like this here, depending on what test you do, the printout may look different. You have a printout, you have to assess, is the test reliable? That's the very first thing you'll have to do before taking any consideration or making any clinical decisions with regards to the visual field defect. So you'll have to look at the fixation loss rate. What fixation loss means is, because during the test, the patient will be required to fixate onto the center of the bowl or the center of the actual machine itself. When they look inside to the visual field testing machine, they'll be required to fixate on a light that's located in the center. When they look away from the light, that's regarded as a fixation loss, meaning they don't look where they're supposed to be looking, so that's regarded as fixation loss. Too many fixation losses would mean that the test would be unreliable. The specific value given here is, if you have less than 20% of fixation losses, then that would be a reliable test. But if you have 20% or more, then that would be regarded as an unreliable test. For example, what the visual field machine will do is, it will pinpoint the patient blind spot, and it will then present the stimulus at their blind spot. So they would not be able to perceive that stimulus. So the machine expects the patient not to press the button. They press the button every time they see a stimulus being presented to them. But if they press the button, then the machine is aware that they are not looking, or they're not fixating on the central light in the machine. So it will then count it as one fixation loss. So 20% meaning the number of times the machine presents the stimulus at their blind spot against the number of times that they affirm that they saw the stimulus. If they saw the stimulus while the stimulus was being presented at their blind spot, it means they were not looking at the central light. So for example, the machine, if it presented the stimulus at their blind spot 10 times, and the patient clicked the button on one occasion only out of those 10 times, so 1 out of 10 fixation losses, that would be a reliable test. However, if it was 2 out of 10, then that would be 20%. That would be regarded as an unreliable test. False negative error and false positive error. So if it's 33% or more of them, then that would also be regarded as an unreliable test. Sorry. False negative means that the stimulus was presented to the patient, but the patient did not press the button. And false positive means that there was no stimulus presented, but the patient pressed the button anyway. Press the button meaning they are saying they saw a stimulus, however, there was no stimulus presented to them. That's false positive. So these are the 3 key figures you will use to gauge the reliability of the visual field test. So going back to that printout, what you'll find these figures here: fixation losses, false positive, and false negative errors. And they are mapped out over there. So we'll zoom in a little bit more. So here we can see 1 out of 13 fixation losses. 1 out of 13 fixation losses there. So that would be regarded as a reliable test because the machine presented the stimulus 13 times to the patient blind spot. And only on 1 of those occasions the patient clicked the button. So this is less than 20% fixation loss. So that's regarded as reliable. And then the false positive error, so 1%, that's also regarded as reliable, and false negative error 0%, that's regarded as reliable also. Okay, and then this is just a diagram showing what you might see in a visual field plot printout if you had a glaucomatous visual field defect. This, what you see here, is an example of an arcuate defect. These nerve fibers here are the papillomacular bundles, as we saw in the diagram earlier. So if this area is damaged, this is what you will see in terms of its visual field defect. You'll notice when the inferior part of the papillomacular bundle is affected, you'll find the defect, the patient will see it in the superior part of their visual fields. Because as I said earlier, you'll find that everything is inverse. Because the inferior part of the retina is responsible for the projection of the superior part of the visual field, and the superior part of the retina is responsible for the inferior part of the visual field. Likewise, the nasal part of the retina is responsible for the temporal field, and the temporal part of the retina is responsible for the nasal field. So this is an example of an arcuate defect, and that's a glaucomatous defect. And the next one, this is the blind spot here. So this is the right eye we are looking at, and you see a visual field defect over here. And the nasal part of the visual field, this is regarded as a nasal step visual field defect. So these 2 diagrams are just there to show you what you might expect to see if you saw a visual field printout or visual field plot where the patient has a visual field defect or glaucomatous visual field defect. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed that and you benefited from that.